June 4, 1943, Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. German Captain Friedrich Lang watched the American coast emerging from the fog through the porthole and muttered contemptuously, "They don't know what they're doing." For him, as for much of the Wehrmacht's high command, the United States was a confused, racially fragile, industrially inefficient and morally corrupted country, a nation of consumption, not combat, a noisy machine without doctrine. That conviction was about to face its worst defeat, not on the battlefield, but in the face of the vision of a logistic system so large that it did not even need to justify itself, a moral force so solid that he treated his prisoners with respect, not out of weakness, but because he could. The Reich soldiers crossed the Atlantic expecting punishment. They found penicillin. They expected silence and cold. They received music and hot showers. Fields were waiting. They found cities. This is the story of a historical irony. When German POWs arrived in America, it wasn't the bars that destroyed them. It was what they saw through them, because what should be weakness, it was strength, and what should be chaos, it was organization. The final defeat of Nazism began with an incomprehensible vision, the enemy. He didn't look like an enemy. But before we dive into the data, there's one statistic that defines this story better than any battle. Among the 425,000 German soldiers captured and taken to the United States, more than 70% returned to Germany, admiring American democracy. And of those, dozens have become political leaders, teachers, engineers, not because of indoctrination, but because they saw something impossible to ignore. Factories running 24 hours a day without whips, cities lit up in the middle of war, supermarkets throwing away food that would be treasure in Europe. What the Germans called bourgeois weakness. It proved to be efficiency on an industrial scale. And this revelation didn't come from above. It came from the ground, from the prison camps, from the trains, from the ordinary gestures that carried extraordinary ideas. If you value stories based on archives, data, and twists that change the course of the century, consider supporting this channel with your like and subscription. This helps us to keep the memory alive and to reveal, with respect and precision, the details that the war tried to bury. When U.S. Navy prison ships docked at Norfolk Naval Base in June 1943, Wehrmacht prisoners expected to see a scene of military tension, armed men around every corner, and civilians hiding in panic. Instead, what they found was a scene that, to minds trained in Reich aesthetics and discipline, seemed like a delusion. 30-meter-high cranes operated in perfect synchrony, moving containers and turrets like mechanical toys. Docks that stretched beyond the horizon simultaneously received and supplied dozens of ships, including battleships and heavy cruisers. Civilian workers, many of them black, maneuvered the equipment alongside white engineers. Women operated cranes, drove forklifts, and supervised loads. Children sold newspapers in the vicinity of the base. And no one, absolutely no one, showed fear in front of the grey uniforms of the German prisoners. For the newcomers from the African and European fronts, that sight was the first blow. The racial doctrine that underpinned the mental structure of German officers was beginning to fail. Propaganda that portrayed the United States as a decadent, mixed, dysfunctional society did not envision a military base that functioned as an autonomous city, vibrant, integrated, and, above all, absurdly efficient. Norfolk was the largest naval base on the planet, with more than 4,300 acres and the capacity to move tons of supplies per hour. Its daily operation outpaced the logistics of many entire German cities. In a single morning, according to Navy records, the base processed more cargo than the port of Hamburg did in an entire week. The psychological effect of this comparison was immediate. German officers, trained under the logic of Reich technical supremacy, tried to assimilate what they saw. American supply lines that didn't just work, they overflowed. Germany, which had struggled to maintain its fronts with minimal resources, now saw the enemy treat them with indifferent abundance. And there was something even more disturbing: the weather, the absence of tension. Unlike German bases where any movement took place under constant fear of bombing or sabotage, Norfolk operated naturally. American soldiers walked unhurriedly. A brass band played patriotic marches to collect war bonds a few meters from the freighters. A coffee vendor offered donuts to civilian workers, while Sherman tanks were unloaded from barges. It didn't feel like a nation at war. It felt like a parallel world where war was just logistics to be managed. This contrast between expectation and reality accentuated the true engine of American war, an economy capable of absorbing the war effort without sacrificing comfort, morale, and the inner workings of society. One of the prisoners, the Unteroffizier Klaus Behrendt, wrote in his memoirs years later, "I expected bars, chains, commands. What I saw was a civilization that seemed to have forgotten that it was at war, but ironically, that was exactly why it was winning." The American military guides who greeted the prisoners spoke fluent German. The terms of the Geneva Convention were read aloud. The rules of conduct, feeding, and rest were clearly explained. Jewish soldiers delivered Red Cross packages to Wehrmacht officers, a gesture so unacceptable in Nazi racial logic that many thought it was a provocation. But it wasn't. It was just protocol. At this point of arrival, a technical fact puts everything in perspective. In 1943, the United States produced a Liberty ship every 4 days. Germany, in the same period, could barely replace one submarine lost in combat per week. If this number surprises you, write in the comments, "Logistics wins," because that's exactly what the Germans began to realize. Still on the outskirts of Norfolk, the prisoners watched the city run with an almost carefree routine. Newspapers published updates on the front with graphs, tables, and analyses. There was no apparent censorship. The radio played popular music and sports broadcasts. Civilians walked freely near military installations. The war, though present, had not dominated American life. It had been absorbed into a system too large to panic. This arrival in Norfolk was, for many, the first snap, a subtle shake-up in the structure of certainties built by years of doctrine. And at the same time, an introduction to the real battlefield that awaited them. Not the barbed wire enclosure, but the unappealable contrast between the scarcity of Germany and the functional excess of the United States. The ideological collapse would still take months, but it began there on the ship's lookout, on the dock platform at the first coffee served by a black enemy, smiling, without anger in his eyes. Because at that moment, without shooting, without shouting, without speeches, the German prisoners began to understand that they had been defeated by something they had never learned to fight, well-organized freedom, and they hadn't even boarded the train yet, because the next shock would come on the rails, and what they would see crossing the American countryside would be even more incomprehensible, a nation where even trains defied German military logic. In the days following arrival in Norfolk, German prisoners were held in screening areas near the base, and while awaiting transfer to camps inland, they were given limited freedom of movement and observation. And it was there, amid the back and forth of supply trucks, railroad convoys, and civilian cafeterias, that they began to register a phenomenon even more disturbing than the cranes and the polyglot guides: the complete absence of fear. There were no sirens, there were no blackouts, there was no camouflage over military structures. The factories that produced artillery pieces or airframes did not hide their names. Glen L. Martin displayed its illuminated sign, visible from the railroad track, while workers left their shifts in their own cars and listened to jazz on the radio. Young civilians passed among armed soldiers as if they were part of the same urban body. For the Germans, who had crossed a Europe marked by air paranoia, scarcity, and the propaganda of total encirclement, this tranquility was incomprehensible. The doctrine of the Reich taught that a nation at war could only survive through absolute discipline, the sacrifice of all, the uniformity of civil life. The state controlled the radio, the food, the factory, and thought. In America, they saw something quite the opposite: freedom operating more efficiently than any authoritarian regime. American security was not based on containment, but on redundancy. The scale was the shield. The United States did not hide its resources, it showed them off. Not as bravado, but because they didn't need to protect themselves from what they could replace in days. The impression became more disconcerting by the hour. The newspapers available even in the military areas brought open criticism of the government, the generals, and the campaign mistakes themselves. A local newspaper discussed logistical failures in the Battle of Kasserine in an acidic and uncensored tone. For Wehrmacht officers, who came from a state where even a private letter was examined, it was the same as institutional mockery. But instead of generating contempt, it generated confusion. How could a government allow such a level of exposure and still maintain respect and control? How could a people criticize their own president in the midst of war and continue winning battles? At the port, Dozens of vessels were supplied in successive shifts. Prisoners saw daily thousands of tons of ammunition, provisions, tanks, uniforms and engines being stacked with precision. The pace was constant, but never chaotic. Every man, every machine, every crane operated as part of a single organism. But there were no screams. There were no commissioners supervising, only civilian workers, many dressed in ordinary clothes, performing tasks with automatic precision. There was even laughter. War there was a function, not a burden. This naturalness, this absence of military theatricality, directly wounded the German vision of power. In the Reich, strength was synonymous with spectacle. Parades, rigid uniforms, shouted orders, raised fists. In America, strength was flow, silent, functional, almost invisible, and that was exactly why it scared him. For Sergeant Ludwig Heinz, captured in Tunisia, the decisive moment came when he saw a group of American soldiers eating hamburgers a few meters from a line of newly landed tanks. He wrote, "They ate as if nothing was happening, as if we weren't here." That destroyed me more than any interrogation. What the Americans called normality, the Germans interpreted as recklessness. But, little by little, the perception changed. That wasn't recklessness. It was overconfidence, not arrogance, but a kind of structural certainty that dispensed with theater. The city was still alive, the civilians were still free, the system was still producing. War, for the United States, was another sector of the economy. It did not require the militarization of civilian life, because power was already embedded in daily life itself. This contrast between the militarization of the Reich and the American fluidity disarmed without words the conviction of the prisoners. And most disconcertingly, no one there seemed interested in impressing them. The Americans did not show off their achievements, they just operated, and it was this operational silence that screamed the loudest. Among the logistical reports of the time, a specific figure summarizes this reality. In 1943, while Germany produced about 300 tanks per month, the United States manufactured 2,500, distributing them over 3 combat fronts, without interruption in domestic supply. If this is already impressive, consider this. This production was done without drastically altering the lifestyle of the civilian population. No dictatorship had achieved such a feat. And that was the ultimate irony. What the Reich considered weakness, freedom of the press, consumption, racial diversity, private enterprise, was actually the engine that sustained American superiority. The controlled chaos of the United States defeated the rigid order of Nazi Germany without firing a shot. On the outskirts of the base, prisoners listened to the radio play Louis Armstrong, while American families bought candy in bakeries, even though convoys of tanks were parked 2 streets away. The city worked, the economy turned, and the war continued. Nothing stopped. Everything coexisted. This coexistence between the war effort and civilian life, which for the average German would be inconceivable, became the greatest source of ideological deconstruction. But that was just the surface. The real shock was yet to come, because soon the trains would arrive, and with them a new phase of exposure. The journey to the interior of the United States, where prisoners would be taken in padded wagons, along lines that cut through visible factories, working steel mills, and mechanized farms that operated like small countries. What they would see through those windows would dismantle not only the myth of American scarcity, but the very idea that the Reich had understood the world it was trying to conquer. As they boarded the trains that would take them from ports to prison camps, scattered throughout the interior of the United States, the German soldiers expected something similar to what they knew: freight cars, barbed wire, darkness, stuffiness, and short orders between shouts. They expected the logistical humiliation, the symbolic breakdown, the transport of the enemy like cattle. But that's not what they found. The American trains that were waiting for them were passengers, not freight. Padded seats, large windows, regular stops. Driven with impeccable railway precision, the trains crisscrossed the country with almost mathematical punctuality. And it was through these windows that the prisoners of the Reich began to see what they had never been allowed to imagine: power without camouflage. Each station was a portrait of freedom operating in its most functional form. Families said goodbye to soldiers on duty. Young men kissed their girlfriends under the awnings of the platforms. Children ran between suitcases. Civilians waved to the prisoners with a mixture of curiosity and neutrality. There was no insult, no derision. For many Americans, those Reich soldiers were only passing cogs in a war that the national machine had already assimilated. And for the prisoners, It was the first time they had seen themselves as irrelevant. The stops in cities like Richmond, Washington, and Harrisburg revealed a war routine that didn't look like war at all. Cinemas open, markets stocked, young people listening to music on the collective headphones of the stations. A group of teenagers shared milkshakes in a cafeteria while the train stopped. The line separating the civilian world from the war effort seemed to have completely dissolved. What for the Reich would be an environment of surveillance and deprivation, for Americans was just another working day. Along the way, armaments and aviation factories became visible through the window. The Glen L. Martin complex in Baltimore displayed its hangars filled with B-26 bombers lined up for delivery. The prisoners were able to count the aircraft, see the workers getting into their cars in the crowded parking lots. No attempt to hide the production, no apparatus of visual disguise. One of the German officers recorded in his letter to the family, "They do not fear that we should see, because they know that we couldn't stop it even if we wanted to." Further on, Pennsylvania's coal mines operated in 3 shifts. The chimneys of the steel mills lit up the night sky with a continuous orange color, a sign that the blast furnaces did not stop. The American industrial rhythm was uninterrupted, but without the terror of totalitarianism. Workers came and went in shifts, visibly well-fed, in clean clothes, and many in wristwatches, a luxury item in devastated Germany. Abundance was not only visible, it was organized, distributed, systematized. The most symbolic moment occurred at the stop in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, where prisoners watched workers exit a metallurgical plant. One of them, faced with an apple eaten half over, simply threw it away and took another from the lunchbox. The scene, documented in later accounts, deeply shocked Wehrmacht officers, some of whom had witnessed men fighting over potato skins on the North African front. The idea that a civilian worker, not an officer, not a general, but an ordinary laborer, could dispose of food in the middle of the war was interpreted as a sign of insanity. But soon the perception changed. That wasn't waste. It was material redundancy. The American economy could afford this luxury. With each mile, the German doctrine of scarcity as a virtue began to disintegrate. The propaganda that said that the United States was a decadent nation, sustained by undisciplined immigrants and dissolved values, clashed with the material evidence of a power that not only sustained 3 fronts, but did so with reservations. The wagons were not armored. The tracks were not escorted by troops. American structural confidence dispensed with absolute control. This visual and sensory exposure produced a silent psychological effect, the beginning of ideological collapse. War, for the United States, was not an existential crusade. It was a logistical function. Germany needed to believe that it was fighting against chaos, but the trains showed the opposite. The chaos, if it existed, was on the side of those who watched through the window. A technical fact confirms this turnaround. In 1943, the United States operated more than 230,000 kilometers of active railroads, with a transport capacity of more than 3 million tons per day, without having to militarize the system. If this number defines anything, it is that the war was won before it even reached the battlefield. Major Karl Helmut, who is in charge of logistics in North Africa, is quoted as saying in a letter circulated among the prisoners, "We didn't know what we were facing. It was not an army. It was a civilization organized on an industrial scale." This realization was not just confession, it was a point of no return, but if the rails showed the surface of power, the fields would reveal something even more disconcerting. Because what the Germans expected to find as punishment, it would arrive as hospitality, beds, electric light, hot showers, and something more disturbing than anything, a canteen where prisoners could choose what to buy. The real shock was yet to come. Camp Hearn, Texas, latitude 30 degrees north. As they stepped off the trains and crossed the camp's main gate, Wehrmacht prisoners prepared for what they knew from other conflicts: makeshift fences, toilet pits, howls of command, cold, boredom, and hunger. But what they found was the absolute opposite. The facilities, arranged in standardized blocks, had organized dormitories, individual iron beds with mattresses, a hot shower system, and a well-equipped infirmary. The buildings were clean, functional, and planned. The internal canteen offered soap, stationery, chocolate, and even American cigarettes. But the detail that completely destabilized the prisoners' sense of reality was the existence of an internal bargaining chip issued by the camps themselves that soldiers could use after paid work. Receiving payment as a prisoner was, for any mind shaped by Nazi doctrine, an impossible gesture. For them, either he was the dominator or he was the vanquished. But there in the American camps there was a third role, the enemy treated with operational dignity. The camp was guarded, yes, but not in a climate of terror. The guards, largely veterans of the campaign, maintained discipline without sadism. In their accounts, prisoners confessed to a new discomfort. They were respected, and this respect seemed not to come from fear or submission, but from a culture that believed that victory also passed through the treatment of the vanquished. Some even suspected psychological manipulation. Others believed it was an attempt to extract information, but none of this happened. The real goal was deeper, to expose German soldiers to a functional, free, and productive society so that they themselves could tell the difference. The structure of the camps, built by civil engineers hired by the US Army, followed industrial standards. Each unit was self-sufficient: generators, laundry rooms, central kitchens with industrial refrigerators, classrooms, areas for religious worship, and even spaces for cultural activities, such as music and painting. To officers like Hauptmann Dieter Moser, who had fought at Stalingrad, it all seemed like an illusion. In his diary he wrote, "If it is a prison, it is the most efficient that has ever existed. If it's propaganda, it's more subtle than anything Goebbels has ever tried." In the central block of Camp Herne was a library, stocked with books in English and German, technical manuals, classic novels, history volumes, and even newspapers translated from the American press circulated freely among the prisoners. The permission to read and exchange opinions openly contrasted with the Third Reich system of internal censorship. Little by little, what seemed like kindness revealed its strength: freedom of access to information, a concept that sounded too subversive to be real. The canteen, stocked with surplus products from the military supply chain, functioned with commercial precision. Soap, for example, was manufactured in Kansas City and transported weekly. Hershey's chocolate came from Pennsylvania. Lucky Strike and Camel cigarettes were distributed in controlled batches, just as they were for American soldiers. But the impact wasn't the taste, it was the system. The logistics chain that fed the camps was the same that supplied the combat fronts. That said a lot. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. The system that broke their convictions did not use weapons. It used structure, routine, and constancy. Democracy in that format did not need doctrine. It was enough to work. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support, like and subscribe, so we can bring you more detailed content like this. Because each piece of data that resurfaces helps to reconstruct a forgotten truth. The silent force that conquered tyranny was not only steel, but moral coherence. The system of work in the camps was optional, respected the Geneva Convention, and allowed prisoners to choose agricultural, industrial, or administrative duties. They worked in textile factories, plantations, small mechanical repairs, and were paid for it. With this payment, they could not only consume goods, but send part of the money back to the family via diplomatic channels of the Red Cross. This level of social functionality within a prison camp was unheard of, and for the Germans, devastating in its simplicity. One statistic illustrates this point. In 1944, the US War Department was responsible for 511 active camps, with the operational capacity to house and sustain more than 370,000 prisoners in simultaneous operation, all supplied by independent logistics chains that did not directly affect the front. It was a country fighting a global war, and yet he found the energy to keep his prisoners with technical dignity. But the deepest blow didn't come from the beds, nor from the soap, nor from the books. It came from a small wooden board at the entrance to the recreation room. In it was only said, "Freedom begins with the mind." The message was clear, and it didn't need propaganda to infiltrate. Each prisoner knew that he was facing something that his own regime would never allow, and this contrast between what they knew and what they were experiencing was the real battlefield. But the exhibition was not over, because after adapting to the initial shock, the Germans would begin to observe something even more unthinkable: the American racial structure. And what for them was a symbol of weakness, it would soon prove to be one of the greatest moral turning points of the war. By being assigned to supervise jobs on farms and industrial facilities near Camp Herne, the German prisoners believed they would finally experience the real weight of defeat: forced labor, grueling hours, relentless surveillance. But reality revealed something more disturbing: efficiency without oppression. The routine started early, but it was clear, predictable, and human. Agricultural work under intense sun, yes, but with regular breaks, access to drinking water, full meals, and return to the field at the end of the day with free time. Within weeks, the Germans were working side by side with American civilians, operating cotton mills, harvesters, and tractors that single-handedly performed the work of 100 men. To the soldiers who came from a continent of rationing, this scale of production seemed absurd. On one of the farms in Milam County, a platoon of prisoners witnessed an automated mill process tons of cotton in a single shift, something that in Germany would take days if electricity were available. One of the civilian workers, a 23-year-old Texan named Doyle Carter, casually remarked, "This is nothing. In Oklahoma there are machines 3 times bigger." The prisoners did not laugh. They were busy trying to understand how a civil society could have such infrastructure in the midst of war. The harvesters not only cut and separate, but automatically compressed production into transportable blocks. The tractors used tracks reinforced with metal alloys that lasted for hundreds of kilometers without maintenance, a stark contrast to German vehicles, which required constant repairs, specific parts, and high consumption of refined fuel, something increasingly scarce on the Eastern Front. The impact of these remarks was not just technical, it was moral. The Germans found that they had underestimated not only the American numbers, but the production philosophy behind them. Even more surprising was the behavior of the civilians. They worked at a steady pace, but without visible tension. Many brought small portable radios that tuned into news and country music while operating machinery. Others made jokes, shared sandwiches, stopped to read the newspaper during breaks. This naturalness generated a deep discomfort. Was it possible to maintain high productivity without tight control? Was it possible to lead without shouting? The prisoners were slowly confronted with a notion that ran counter to their entire education. High morale, basic comfort, and autonomy generated more results than discipline through fear. At the beneficiation facilities near Waco, the Germans witnessed a full shift of light ammunition packing operated at 70% by women. The supervisor, a man in his early 40s, led the group with technical instructions but in a respectful tone. The yield of that line exceeded in hours what the Germans achieved in days under the model of militarized factories. More than productivity, there was a spirit of cohesion that escaped authoritarian logic. There was no need for hatred to work. Contact with civilians also destabilized propagandistic narratives. Americans were neither ignorant brutes nor morally lax, as the Nazi media repeated. Many workers had higher education, discussed politics, knew European geography. One of them asked a prisoner where the accent came from, recognizing the difference between a Berliner and a Bavarian. Another quoted Thomas Mann. This degree of familiarity with German culture was disconcerting to men who had been taught to despise the soulless enemy. As the weeks passed, the perception was reversed. The American system, which from the Nazi doctrinal point of view was supposed to collapse under freedom itself, proved to be more resistant, more adaptable, and more productive than any centralized apparatus. The secret was in the distribution of responsibilities, in the autonomy of the lower levels, in structural trust. In an informal conversation, an American sergeant said that the harvesters used in the Texan plantations were adapted versions of Caterpillar models, originally designed for civil construction, but now repurposed for agricultural use. This versatility shocked the prisoners. In Germany, each machine was made for a single purpose. The improvised adaptation was seen as a failure of planning. In America, it was celebrated as dynamic efficiency. In their observation notebooks, prisoners obsessively recorded details: the type of metal used in the shovels, the pressurized irrigation system of the farms, the autonomy of the diesel engines, the variety of tools available even in the simplest sheds. Everything pointed to a disciplined excess, a functional abundance that was not displayed as wealth but used as a tool. This continuous exposure caused what later analysts would call a breach of symbolic doctrine. It wasn't just the loss of physical warfare, it was the dismantling of a belief system. For soldiers trained on the idea that only the state could generate order, and that the people, without strict control, would degenerate into chaos. Seeing ordinary civilians producing more than militarized factories was an intolerable revelation. One statistic sums up the impact well. In 1944, the United States produced more food per hectare with fewer workers than any European country at peace. In war, they maintained this rate and still exported to allies. This combination of productivity and internal stability was an invisible but lethal weapon. Unteroffizier Ernst Hallmann, in a censored but preserved note, wrote, "Germany is losing the war because we are fighting a nation that does not need to win battles, it just needs to keep functioning." But the prisoners had not yet seen the greatest paradox. Because in the camp cafeteria, where food was distributed with mathematical regularity, they would witness something even more challenging: waste, a banal act for some, but unforgivable for others. And it was there, in the discarding of excess, that true superiority would be revealed. In the following weeks, as the prisoners adjusted to the routine of the camps, another kind of confrontation began to occur, not physical, not material, but mental. It was the war between structures of thought. For the Nazi doctrine, the cohesion of a nation depended on three pillars: absolute unity, political silence, and veneration of command. A country that tolerated dissent in times of war was, by definition, weak, divided, on the verge of collapse. But America seemed to work exactly the other way around. In the very first days at Camp Herne, the Germans began to have access to civilian newspapers distributed by American supervisors. Many of them carried headlines that, if published in Berlin, would result in immediate arrest: criticism of President Roosevelt, cartoons mocking generals, editorials against tax increases, and even protests by farmers who felt exploited by the war effort. To the prisoners, it looked like printed sabotage, but it was only Tuesday. Over lunch in the camp, Reich soldiers watched civilians arguing in the mess hall about foreign policy, congressional decisions, and even whether the war was just or not. One of them, a Missouri worker on a technical visit to the farm attached to the field, commented, "I think we are sending too much supply to England. Let them fight for themselves." The phrase was said in a normal tone, without fear of denunciation or punishment. For the Germans, this was inconceivable. For years, hearing any criticism of the Führer resulted in sudden disappearances. But there, power tolerated, even encouraged, debate, and the country continued to function. The radio, a ubiquitous piece on farms and in the common rooms of the countryside, transmitted a variety of voices. Some programs openly supported the government, others ridiculed him. Comedians imitated American generals with stilted accents, while commentators attacked domestic policies like the New Deal. And even with all this diversity of opinions, tanks kept leaving the factories, convoys headed to the Pacific, and the economy turned like a multiple clock. The apparent chaos wasn't noise, it was rhythm. One episode in particular broke the moral axis of many prisoners. During a radio broadcast, a group of journalists discussed whether the prison camps were being too good to the Germans. One of them said that the American people needed to be tougher, colder, more German in the conduct of the war. The radio operator, an African-American soldier from the camp, laughed and commented, "See, here everyone complains about everything." To the prisoners, this line wasn't just comical, it was revealing. The state did not need to suffocate the citizen to maintain authority. He could allow disagreement and still win. The basis of this trust was redundancy. The American system was too big to collapse with a critique. The press, even divided, maintained a collective function: to supervise, to inform, to provoke. And rather than weakening morale, this friction created a more resilient social fabric. The diversity of opinions prevented the emergence of a single thought, and for this very reason, made total collapses difficult. Each voice found its space, and the result of this was not disorder, it was anti-fragility. In the camps, arguments began to arise among the prisoners themselves. Some younger people began to question in low voices, why is a system that criticizes itself so much so efficient? Still, others resisted, believing that it was all staging. But over time, the repetition of the evidence outweighed the doctrine. There was no censorship in the papers. There was no omission in the bulletins. America did not hide its mistakes. It published them. And yet, it surpassed Germany in production, transportation, innovation, and resilience. One specific fact circulated among the prisoners through pamphlets accidentally left in one of the newspaper depositories. In 1943, more than 1,800 daily newspapers were in circulation in the United States, with divergent political positions, while Germany operated under a single centralized and censored press organ. This comparison summed it all up. Where there was a single voice, there was rigidity. Where there were many, there was adaptation. Lieutenant Friedrich Rahn, a former propaganda assistant in Berlin, summed it up in a confidential post-war report. We discovered that the apparent weakness of democracy was actually its immune system. American dissent worked like a controlled virus. It tested the limits, provoked responses, strengthened the organism. This perception changed the tone of the conversations in the accommodations. Free speech wasn't just an idea, it was a tool. And within the camp structure, with controlled but sufficient access to the American media, prisoners were gradually exposed to a universe that did not depend on blind obedience to function. What the Reich called moral weakness turned out to be a technical advantage. And what the Germans considered confusion was actually a complex dance of autonomy and interdependence. But this process still had more to offer, because in addition to freedom of criticism, there was something that no prisoner expected to witness: the functional coexistence between races, even with tensions. The presence of African American soldiers and workers, free, armed, educated, and sometimes superiors, would represent an even greater shake-up of the Nazi ideological edifice. And that would be the next slit. Because for men who had been indoctrinated to believe in racial purity as the engine of civilization, to see the other with real power, it was a silent sentence. Of all the shocks experienced by German prisoners on American soil, none was as profound, as confusing, and as disarming as Christmas 1943. The expectation was for a cold, silent, empty night. Perhaps an ordinary meal, perhaps none. But when they woke up that morning, the Reich soldiers found the living quarters decorated with handmade ornaments, made by children from local schools. In the cafeteria, the table was not only set, it was overflowing. Roast turkey, potatoes au gratin, pumpkin pies, fruitcakes, fresh fruit, coffee and milk. The caloric sum of the supper exceeded 5,000 calories per man. And all of this had not been determined by order of the army, but by voluntary mobilization of the civilian community of Hearne, Texas. The town's children, many of them descendants of German immigrants, had been rehearsing Christmas carols in German for weeks. On the night of the 24th, they entered the gates of the camp escorted by soldiers, not with weapons, but with sheet music. They sang Stille Nacht, O Tannenbaum, and Leise rieselt der Schnee. Many prisoners could not hold back their tears, not out of nostalgia, but out of confusion. How to accept this gesture coming from the enemy? How to reconcile the doctrine of racial superiority with the fact that his supposed inferiors were celebrating his humanity? The Christmas gift was not symbolic. Each prisoner was given a bag of personal items: soap, cigarettes, a candy, stationery, and, for many, a book. Everything organized with names, without distinction of rank. That was not charity under surveillance. It was compassion organized in a system. An action without advertising, without cameras, without medals, and this destabilized more than any military defeat. For the next few days, the camp fell silent. The behavior of the prisoners changed. Some stopped simulating resistance, others began to collaborate more efficiently. A growing number began to frequent the spaces for reading and political discussion, previously ignored due to mistrust. It was as if conviction began to dissolve in the face of an inexplicable goodness. The power of the gesture was not in the excess, it was in the contrast, and the contrast was in the numbers. In Germany, that same winter of 1943 was one of the cruelest. Food rationing meant that soldiers on the Eastern Front received about 1,200 calories a day. In the rear, civilians lived with fewer than 900. And here's the point. A Reich prisoner of war in enemy territory received 4 times as many calories at Christmas as a German fighter at the front. If this data surprised you, comment below with a word that summarizes this reality. Something like absolute power, logistics wins, or unbelievable. The American system didn't just win by production, it won by the culture that could sustain that production, and organized generosity was an extension of that culture. It was not a question of weakness, but of moral strength raised to the population scale. The Christmas gesture was no exception. It was the normal functioning of a society that did not need to be violent to be victorious. Sergeant Wilhelm Kruger, who had previously prided himself on his position on the Russian front, wrote a letter partially censored by the Red Cross. "We were defeated without being touched. They overcame us by abundance and spirit." The phrase, reproduced years later in a Red Cross report, would become a symbol of the moral collapse that many prisoners experienced that winter, and what began as a symbolic gesture turned into a turning point, because from that moment on, The prisoners' eyes stopped looking for flaws in the American system. They started looking for meaning, and what they found was even more disturbing: a society capable of growing even internally contradictory. A machine that included dissenting voices, citizens of multiple origins, and yet produced more tanks, more planes, and more food than any homogeneous state in Europe. But there was one last piece to this puzzle, because as moving as Christmas was, there was one element in the daily life of the camp that the Germans still couldn't comprehend, and that deeply wounded the Reich's racial ideal: the fact that African American soldiers exercised direct authority over German prisoners. And this symbolic reversal for many was more painful than any military defeat. They were about to see the enemy that should not exist, commanding what was left of their pride. Between carefully spaced wire fences and watchtowers that looked more symbolic than threatening, an unexpected phenomenon began to spread through prisoner-of-war camps across the United States. It was not rebellion, nor disobedience. It was curiosity. In the early months of 1944, the U.S. War Office authorized an expansion of the so-called Program of Educational Activities in the camps, and what began as an experiment became a watershed. Prisoners who had previously spent time between work and nostalgia were now given daily access to libraries stocked with titles in German and English. The catalogues included authors banned by the Nazi regime, names like Erich Maria Remarque, Bertolt Brecht, and Thomas Mann. For the first time since the beginning of the war, hundreds of Reich soldiers were reading uncensored and thinking on their own. The classes, initially improvised, soon took shape. American university professors, war veterans or civilian volunteers began to teach regular courses in rooms transformed into classrooms. Basic English, mathematics, mechanics, modern agriculture, world history, and even fundamentals of public administration. For many prisoners, this was the first time they had heard anyone openly criticize their own government without fearing reprisals. The shock was not immediate, but progressive. How to accept that a country would allow such freedom of thought and still work better. At the Trinidad camp in Colorado, a group of prisoners created a weekly internal newspaper, in German, that was reviewed by a committee composed of the soldiers themselves. In the beginning, it brought only neutral information: calendar of activities, weather forecast, jokes and trivial chronicles. But over time, editorials began to raise questions about Germany's future. What would happen after the war? What kind of country would they rebuild? The ideas of self-management and democratic reconstruction began to emerge spontaneously, not by imposition, but by exposure. Americans have understood something fundamental. Totalitarian indoctrination is not reversed by force, but by constant friction with freedom. It was necessary to create environments where thinking differently was not a risk, but a possibility. And for that, it was enough to offer structure, books, and space. The educational system in the camps operated on an industrial logic. Teachers had schedules, prisoners enrolled voluntarily, and were evaluated for performance. The best students were invited to conduct group studies. In a short time, small book clubs, debate groups, rhetoric courses, and writing workshops appeared. In an internal U.S. Army report, one officer noted, "At the end of 4 months, the teaching program reduced disciplinary incidents by 60% and increased prisoner collaboration by 200%. The numbers spoke for themselves, and more than operational efficiency, this impact reflected an ongoing ideological transformation. Nazi doctrine, built on blind obedience and the glorification of disciplined ignorance, was beginning to crumble in the face of knowledge-driven autonomy. The education offered to prisoners was not intended to convert them, but to liberate them intellectually, and that was even more powerful. Instead of directly confronting ideology, it dissolved it by contrast. The men who had once repeated Reich slogans now discussed agricultural systems, civil infrastructure, and freedom of the press. Many began to write letters to their relatives in Germany, telling them about the courses, the books, the conversations. Without realizing it, they became agents of their own doctrinal deconstruction. A case recorded in the Algona Field, Iowa, is emblematic. A former Luftwaffe officer, Hans Kruger, began teaching mechanics to younger prisoners after attending the basic engineering course offered at the camp. In his classes, he began to intersperse technical concepts with critical analyses of how the American productive model managed to surpass the German one even without centralized imposition. In his diary he wrote, "What impresses me most is that they teach us without wanting to convince us. This, to me, is their greatest weapon. The impact of this process went beyond the fences of the fields. Reports from the International Red Cross indicate that prisoners who have passed through the American education system have shown significantly less resistance to post-war rehabilitation, demonstrating a greater willingness to rebuild democracy. In numbers, it is estimated that between 1944 and 1946, about 18,000 German prisoners formally participated in educational programs in the US, the largest informal re-education experiment ever recorded in the midst of a military conflict. This strategy, invisible to the naked eye, was one of the most lethal against the Nazi project, because while Germany invested in indoctrination camps, America responded with classrooms. While the Reich burned books, the US distributed them. The war of ideas did not need weapons. It needed libraries, desks, and electric light. But the transformation did not stop there, because the real chasm that still separated German thought from American reality was about to be exposed, not in books, but in human relations. Prisoners who believed in Aryan racial superiority would now have to live with, obey, and even learn from African American soldiers in commanding positions. And this symbolic reversal was an even deeper blow. The next step would not be technical, it would be moral and definitive. The definitive rupture of many Nazi convictions among prisoners of war did not happen on the battlefield, nor in classes on democracy. It materialized at a time when Wehrmacht men were forced to raise their arms for inspections conducted by African American soldiers, armed, trained, and in commanding positions. The racial doctrine of the Third Reich, taught from its youth, crumbled silently in the face of facts that could not be denied. Those who should have been considered inferior now decided schedules, inspected barracks, meted out punishments, and in many cases acted with more professionalism and dignity than the German officers themselves. The symbolic gulf between theory and reality has never been so deep. In the field hospitals and medical posts in the camps, the situation went beyond the armed authority. African American doctors, graduates of universities like Howard and Meharry, performed clinical exams, administered vaccines, diagnosed illnesses, and signed the charts of high-ranking prisoners, including lieutenants and captains. For men who had spent years being told that racial purity equaled technical competence, being seen by a black American physician, fluent in 2 languages and with a knowledge of modern bacteriology, was an experience of silent shock. There was no denying competence in the face of the result. Sergeant Otto Reinhardt, in charge of a captured platoon at Monte Cassino, wrote months later in his diary, "The Americans not only have a larger army, they have an army that includes those we thought were unworthy, and they work. They work better than us." At one of the medical screening sessions at Camp Swift in Texas, the senior nurse, African American, trained in military nursing, directly questioned a Luftwaffe captain about his diet, noting symptoms accurately and prescribing a dietary change. The officer, hesitantly, replied in a passive tone. As he left the room, there was no joke, no murmur, just silence. What was seen as an aberration weeks before was now imposed by the force of competence. The impact was not only moral, it was structural. The prisoners began to realize that the American machine was made up of gears of all colors. In the fields, blacks and whites worked together. In the camps, African American soldiers were part of the patrols, coordinated schedules, delivered mail, conducted interrogations with simultaneous translation. The segregation regime still existed, yes, but even within its limitations, the presence of blacks in essential functions destroyed any vestige of racial superiority that the Germans could still sustain. At Alva Field, Oklahoma, the Guard platoon was mostly composed of black soldiers from the 370th Infantry Regiment. Trained, disciplined, and armed, these men not only maintained order, but also participated in the logistical organization of the camp. And even more symbolically, they did so without any trace of humiliation or revenge. This professional neutrality was the final blow to Nazi belief. The dignity with which they were treated by those whom the regime described as subhuman hurt more than any weapon. U.S. intelligence reports, assessing the psychological behavior of prisoners, identified this phenomenon as symbolic hierarchy collapse. When the order of the world, taught from childhood, is reversed before the eyes, and the new order works better, the brain retreats, tries to resist, but finally gives in. The camp commandant at Camp Robinson, reported that after 6 months of living with African American soldiers, there was a drop of more than 80% in explicit racist manifestations among prisoners. This data alone is revealing, and even more so when compared to the structure of the Reich itself. By 1944, Germany was already facing critical labor shortages, with industries operating below capacity. Even so, it refused to integrate its colonial territories, minorities or foreigners in a functional way into the production system. The United States, for all its contradictions, had incorporated more than 1 million African Americans into logistical, medical, administrative and military roles. The American machine won because it knew how to use all its arms. The Reich lost because it cut off its own by ideology. If this finding surprised you, write in the comments a word that sums up this paradox: real strategy, unexpected force, or simply total inversion. The central point is this: what was despised proved to be indispensable, and it wasn't just the presence, it was the performance. Prisoners noticed that supply convoys coordinated by African American drivers had a lower failure rate, that hospitals maintained by mixed teams were more efficient, that black soldiers often knew more about the war than they knew themselves. American efficiency was multiracial, and that, to the mind shaped by exclusion, was more than unacceptable. It was unimaginable. Private Ernst Vogel, once a fervent follower of racial doctrine, declared in a voluntary interrogation, "I no longer understand what superiority is. If the inferior ones work better, what are we?" This question, asked with sincerity, sums up the complete bankruptcy of the Reich's symbolic engineering. But there was still one last layer of this ideological dismantling, because inside the workshops and libraries, the Germans would discover that in addition to racial inclusion, the United States practiced another heresy in the eyes of the Reich: the intellectual freedom of women in technical, scientific, and administrative functions. The next step would be to see, with their own eyes, women operating war machines and managing logistics warehouses. And this, for those who had been trained to see women as an appendage of the home, was more than subversive. It was the end of a world. What impressed the German POWs most were not the tanks being transported on trains with mathematical precision, nor the bombers in continuous production in the factories that never stopped. The most humiliating, intimate, and most devastating blow came from something much simpler: garbage. In food warehouses, distribution centers, and canneries, Reich soldiers witnessed in amazement a daily ritual that contradicted everything they had experienced on the battlefield: tons of food being discarded for reasons that sounded absurd to them. Intact cans of corn were rejected because the label was poorly attached. Fresh fruit went straight into the disposal buckets for small aesthetic stains. Processed meats were separated and burned because they had a slight change in color, not in quality, but in presentation. For those who had come from the siege of Tobruk or the retreat from North Africa, where soldiers fought over moldy bread and scraped bones for fat, it wasn't just waste, it was luxury. And luxury in war is a form of domination. In the state of Illinois, prisoners assigned to supervised labor at a cannery quietly recorded what they saw: conveyors moving more food in one morning than an entire Axis garrison received in a week. The production line worked with redundancy. There was enough food to allow error and still maintain efficiency. A refused can was not a loss. It was part of the calculation, and this technical detail turned into psychological trauma. The American machine was so productive that it could afford to be demanding, and even so feed millions. In Texas, at a fruit processing station, prisoners saw trucks dumping tons of oranges and apples into compost pits. They questioned the guards about the reason. The answer was simple: they did not pass the quality control. A darkened apple, a skin with a slight deformation, a bunch of grapes out of proportion. To the Germans, who had learned to divide a piece of bread into three, this was incomprehensible. And worse, it was not an emergency. It was standard. It was quality politics. Abundance was no exception in the US. It was the norm. In a 1944 internal report of the American Department of Agriculture, it was recorded that the surplus discarded from the American food industry in 1 quarter could supply the entire German Sixth Army for 90 days. A comparison that, if widely disseminated, would have been interpreted as propaganda, but it was only statistics. If this data surprised you, write in the comments something that translates this discrepancy: invisible power, war abundance, or strategic excess. The impact of this reality on the prisoners was more ideological than physical. Many did not go hungry in the fields. On the contrary, they received regular food of a higher quality than what many German civilians had at home. But the problem was not what they received, it was what they saw being thrown away. Because what Germany called survival ration, the Americans discarded as technical waste. The comparison was not rhetorical, it was visual, it was practical, and it was unbearable. There was also the symbolic component. For the Reich, the war was total. Every crumb counted. The whole nation was to sacrifice itself. In the US, war seemed to coexist with routine. Women bought cereal with coupons. Children ate donuts before going to school. And factories threw away entire containers of food that didn't meet aesthetic standards. This dissociation between war effort and civilian welfare seemed illogical to the mind indoctrinated in totalitarian scarcity. But it worked. And worse, he won. An episode recorded at Crossville Countryside, Tennessee, sums up the moral crisis caused by excess. During the inspection of a shipment of corned beef, one prisoner sheepishly asked to keep one of the rejected cans. The supervisor replied, "Sorry, but that's not allowed. It's not safe enough for us." The phrase, spoken with kindness, had the weight of a sentence. What the Americans dismissed as not good enough for domestic consumption was, for many German soldiers, a feast, and the fact that it was not out of malice, but because of sanitary rules, made the scene even more cruel. This contrast between excess and control created a specific kind of humiliation. Germany, with all its military engineering, its order and discipline, could not feed its army regularly. The United States, even allowing dispersion, internal criticism, and waste, did not just feed its troops. It exported food to the Allies and kept its civilian population well supplied. Efficiency came not from absolute sacrifice, but from scale. The real American weapon was mass repetition, not individual heroism. And that redefined what power meant. General Dietrich von Müller, captured in 1945, declared in his interrogations, "We have realized too late that American strength is not in the individual soldier, but in the machine that feeds, clothes, equips, and replaces him." This phrase, echoed years later in studies on war logistics, was born from the direct observation of waste. What seemed to be a failure was, in fact, strategic redundancy. But there was still a more powerful image to be revealed, one that combined high morale, industrial competence, and the ultimate symbol of American culture: women operating ammunition factories, driving tractors, controlling assembly lines for airplane parts. The Reich, which saw women as guardians of the home and purity, would discover that the engine of American logistical superiority, it was feminine, and that would be the next ideological coup, the last gear of silent defeat. In the Kansas countryside near the town of Topeka, a group of German prisoners was assigned to accompany the transport and sorting of metal parts destined for military aviation. They expected to find an industrial environment similar to the one they knew in Germany, noisy, authoritarian, driven by dry orders and supervisors armed with shouts. Instead, they found silence, not a silence of absence, but of efficiency. The machines operated at a constant cadence. Conveyors carried parts in perfect synchrony. Civilian workers from different backgrounds came and went in set shifts without fanfare, without rushing. The whistles that marked the rhythm of Nazi production were replaced by clocks and spreadsheets. There was not a single scream. The predominant sound was that of machines, and that sound said it all. Democracy worked in silence. Over the course of weeks of watching the flow of the factories, the prisoners began to notice a pattern that destabilized them more than any open criticism: autonomy. Each sector seemed to know exactly what to do, even in the absence of direct supervision. Discipline did not come from fear, but from the understanding of purpose. The American worker, even without a uniform, seemed to understand the role of his task in the larger machinery of the war. There were no slogans on the walls. There were logistical maps, deadlines, and goals. In Germany, the doctrine of production was centralized to the limit. Every decision required a chain of command, a stamp, a signature. The rhythm was militarized, and the hierarchy sacred. In the United States, the opposite: decentralized decisions, horizontal management, and a system based on technical trust. The production was maintained because everyone knew what they were doing. It was not a factory. It was an organism. Prisoner Hans Breuer, an engineer by training, reported, "I have never seen anything like it. Civilian workers know production flows better than many German officers. Here, power does not scream, calculate. What for the Reich was permissiveness, in the United States was responsibility. The absence of rigidity was converted into agility, and this fluidity operated on a large scale. In 1944, while the Reich was trying to keep 500 armaments factories operational, the United States was overseeing more than 60,000 industrial facilities directly linked to the war effort, with more than 19 million civilians employed. Every hour, a plane, 2 tanks and 4 trucks left the American lines. In spare parts alone, the US produced the equivalent of Germany's entire year's strategic stock per month. If this statistic surprises you, comment below on a word that translates this contrast: unimaginable pace, silent power, or shocking data. But it wasn't just production, it was precision. Each military convoy was loaded in advance. Each foundry operated with supply planning that crossed entire states. The steel mined in Minnesota was weaponized in Ohio, shipped by rail to Texas, and shipped to the Pacific in less than 72 hours. Time, which in Germany was an enemy because of scarcity, in the United States was an ally because of abundance. The gear worked because time had been tamed. OSS intelligence reports pointed out that prisoners' morale decreased not when they saw weapons or soldiers, but when they realized the scale of what they could not destroy: the system. The factory operated 24 hours a day with rotating shifts, but without the need for punishment. There were rest breaks, standardized meals, and even background music in some facilities. The worker smiled as he molded the carcass of a B-24 bomber. This was an unacceptable paradox for the Nazi doctrine, which preached that only suffering forged victory. At Rupert's Camp, Idaho, a group of prisoners was taken to observe the operation of the Logan Iron Works. The dawn shift, considered the most difficult, maintained 95% of regular production with no drop in yield. The supervisor noted, "They're wondering where the whip is." But what kept that system going was another force: fair wages, internal recognition, and the idea that every screw counted. Democracy had quietly built its arms factory on trust. The chief engineer of one of the assembly plants in Missouri, when talking to an interpreter, explained, "Here, we don't tell you what to do, we ask what is best." This management philosophy, almost incomprehensible to minds trained in vertical obedience, was the basis of American productivity. Trust generated responsibility, and responsibility generated efficiency. For the prisoners, the most devastating thing was not the comparison with what was in Germany. It was the realization that they had never imagined this possible. The absence of brutality did not produce weakness. It produced performance. And this was in itself a new military doctrine, to win without dominating. But there was still a blind spot, an aspect of the American war that prisoners began to hear and fear without ever having seen up close. The arsenal on which all the systems they witnessed depended, a support structure so vast, so invisible and so precise that to this day it is considered one of the greatest engineering works in history, the American military railway network. The next step would be to get to know the tracks that fed the monster, and there even geography would be American. In the summer of 1944, a group of German prisoners were transferred to a camp outside Omaha, Nebraska. The train journey, long and comfortable, was no longer surprising as in the first months, but it was when they arrived in the city that the disorientation reached a new level. Sirens were waiting. They found music. They expected tense silence. They heard laughter. They expected looks of hatred. They received curious waves from teenagers who walked with ice cream in their hands and pocket radios hanging from the straps of their skirts. The city was alive. There were no curfews, no lines for bread. In the midst of the war effort, cinemas advertised 3 daily sessions, bakeries were open on Sundays, and in schools, classes continued with students in uniform, not in military clothes, but in light summer clothes. The picture was clear. The United States was at war, but they did not act as if they were. This apparent normality, almost insolent, generated more discomfort than any show of force. In Germany, war was ubiquitous. Thick curtains on windows to prevent light during bombings, severe rationing of food and fuel, sirens and constant announcements from the Ministry of Propaganda. Fear was a routine, survival a daily goal. In the United States, however, the average citizen lived with the feeling that the war was important, but distant. It starts from national life, but not from direct individual experience. The chasm between these two atmospheres was deep and psychologically destabilizing. In Kansas, prisoners watched civilians working on plantations and trades during the day and attending dances to the sound of swing and jazz at night. Churches were packed on Sundays, but not to cry out for survival, but to celebrate weddings and graduations. News of the war arrived through newspapers and radios, but was followed by advertisements for soft drinks and car promotions. American culture seemed to rely too much on its own invulnerability, but this confidence was justified by numbers. By 1944, the United States had reached such a high level of production that the war could literally be managed from a distance. While Germany mobilized teenagers and the elderly to fill gaps in its emptied ranks, the US still had intact industrial and human reserves. Each week, new divisions were formed, not urgently, but with planning. While German cities like Dresden, Essen, and Hamburg were reduced to rubble, cities like Detroit, Chicago, and Dallas grew. Paved streets, opened hospitals. The American territory had never been bombed, production was never interrupted, and civil morale will never plummet. For the prisoners of the Reich, this was the hardest blow. War for the enemy was routine, a logistical challenge, not an existential one, a collective effort, but not desperate. The psychology of the German soldier, built on the idea that war was a total sacrifice, came up against the realization that, for the American, war could coexist with high school football, radio comedies, and movie sessions with popcorn. Private Hans Goering noted in his diary, "They don't hate us, and they are not scared. War for them is a function, not a crisis." This phrase summed up the mental gulf between the two systems, and there was also the technological factor that sustained this tranquility, the ability to project power without disrupting everyday life. B-17 aircraft were produced at a serial pace, without the need for national commotion. Convoys crisscrossed the country with supplies, without affecting civilian supplies. Universities continued to train engineers and doctors, while some students volunteered for the war effort, by choice, not by obligation. American power came not from hysteria, but from structure, and structure he is not shaken by speeches. In an OSS report dated September 1944, a military psychologist noted, "The greatest impact on prisoners is not comfort, but the naturalness with which Americans deal with war. It's as if they had predicted everything decades in advance." And in many ways they did. Since World War I, the United States had studied Europe's logistical mistakes and prepared for a long-term conflict. The American economy had been designed to scale, and this was reflected in civil behavior. One piece of data evidences this logic. Between 1941 and 1945, even with millions of men at the front, the US increased the production of non-essential consumer goods by 20%. While the Reich was putting out windows and closing stores, Americans were launching new refrigerator models, new Hollywood movies, new public parks. The war did not paralyze. It integrated. If this number surprised you, comment below with a term that summarizes this phenomenon: impossible normality, unshakable daily life, or silent scale. Prisoners who worked in the maintenance of railway lines, delivery of supplies, or agricultural support witnessed this every day. The convoys passed without an escort. The grain silos operated with 2-year inventory. The schools taught patriotism, but also chemistry and economics. And the radios, when announcing the Allied advances in Normandy, soon spliced a song by Glenn Miller. The contrast between alarm and routine was unbearable for someone who came from a world where war was experienced as agony. But the moment of greatest shock was yet to come. Because within this universe where war seemed to work like a well-oiled gear, there was a figure who challenged all Nazi doctrines, the American woman, not as passive support, but as an active part of logistics, engineering, the production front line. And for a soldier indoctrinated to see women as guardians of the home and purity, this reality would be the final blow. Because there, between rivets and propellers, ideological defeat would gain a feminine and irrevocable face. In the spring of 1945, in a small Arkansas town called Stuttgart, ironically named after a German metropolis, something unprecedented occurred. The pastor of the local Methodist church decided to open the doors of his congregation to a group of German prisoners of war. That Sunday's sermon would talk about mercy. The gesture at first glance seemed absurd, allowing men who had fought for a regime of hatred to share benches with bereaved mothers, widows of soldiers killed in Normandy, children who prayed for missing fathers in the Pacific. But there, On that spring morning, the songs sung in English and German formed a choir that no longer obeyed the boundaries of nations, only those of the spirit. For the prisoners, the shock was not just cultural, it was spiritual. They had been trained to see the world through the lens of separation, Aryans and non-Aryans, superior and inferior, pure and degenerate. They were taught to believe that the enemy was inhuman, weak, corrupt, atheist or worse, morally permissive. But in front of them, seated on waxed wooden benches, were teary-eyed elderly women offering homemade cakes and Bibles translated into German. Families who had lost children and grandchildren at Monte Cassino handed out welcome cards and recited prayers for the prisoners. This was not a political gesture. It was faith incarnate, and precisely for this reason, unacceptable in the mold of the Third Reich. Nazi ideology depended on an absolute belief in the division between us and them, but in Protestant services in the American countryside, prisoners heard sermons on reconciliation, grace, dignity, and universal brotherhood. In some communities, pastors taught passages of the gospel with the support of interpreters, allowing the Germans to understand the passages read aloud. There was no pressure, invitation only. The result was devastating, in the best sense. In Hearne, Texas, during Christmas 1944, a children's choir made up of city boys sang Stille Nacht, the original version of Silent Night, to an audience of prisoners seated in folding chairs with blankets on their laps and teary eyes. One of the German soldiers, Josef Kepler, would write in his letter, "They sang in our language, they know what we have lost, and yet they offer us comfort." This was the first time that many of these men had seen their humanity recognized by those who had lost everything through their fault. In several locations in the southern USA, community initiatives began to emerge without any central command. Churches donated religious books in German, young people delivered envelopes with messages of peace, church ladies organized Easter lunches and open services, where prisoners could, if they wished, participate. It was not about manipulation. It was a practice rooted in the local Christian tradition, love your enemy. And that love, unconditional, unarmed, and persistent, destabilized more than the steel of a bomber. For the Reich, forgiveness was a sign of weakness. For the American people, it was a show of strength. This moral inversion began to erode the ideological foundations of the prisoners. It was no longer just about industrial efficiency, but about ethical superiority. And this was not measured in tons of steel, but in everyday acts. A Baptist pastor from Mississippi stated in a service, "They came as enemies, but they will come back as witnesses. May they take from here the memory of a people who knew how to hate evil without hating men." The U.S. War Office, realizing the transformative force of these events, not only tolerated these religious actions, it quietly encouraged them. The military authorities understood that the greatest battlefield was the psychological one. It was not enough to defeat Germany on the map. It was necessary to deconstruct what had been built in the hearts of its soldiers, and this was not done with tanks. It was done with blessings. A 1946 survey of repatriated prisoners revealed a striking finding. Among prisoners who attended religious services in the U.S., more than 60% reported that they had changed their view of Americans and the war. Of these, a third said that the religious experience had been more impactful than any political or educational argumentation. It was literally a conversion, not just of faith but of perspective. The irony was devastating. While the Third Reich built its strength on hatred and separation, Americans used the very values that Nazism despised, compassion, faith, and community, as silent weapons of transformation. And it worked. Because in front of a lady with trembling hands, offering a piece of pie to a man who once carried the swastika on his chest, ideology dissolved. But this moral war did not end in the pews. A new type of confrontation began to emerge between the prisoners themselves. Because not everyone accepted this transformation, there was an invisible clash inside the camps, between those who maintained their allegiance to the Reich and those who, touched by the American experience, began to question everything. The prison camp would then become a field of ideological disputes, and the next chapters would reveal that, even far from the front lines, the conflict continued. This time inside his own mind. Inside the prison camps scattered throughout the heartland of the United States, the silent ideological war reached a new phase. The barbed wire walls protected physical integrity, But it was in the improvised libraries and on the radio waves that the mental fortress of the soldiers of the Reich began to crumble. Shelves stocked with works by Thomas Mann, Dostoevsky, Churchill, Marxist, liberal and conservative authors living side by side without censorship. Radio stations tuned to comedy programs that mocked President Roosevelt, editorial cartoons published in newspapers that openly criticized Congress, public protests about military decisions. All of this was part of the routine. To the prisoners, this was incomprehensible. How could a nation at war tolerate this level of public criticism? And more, how did this not generate internal collapse? It was freedom working as a weapon, invisible but relentless. At the Camp McCoy Camp, Wisconsin, locally printed newspapers circulated among the prisoners with news from the front, American politics, and even civilian daily life. Some soldiers began to organize book clubs, others debating ideas among themselves in whispers, away from the eyes of those loyal to Nazism. The transformation was not imposed, it was spontaneous. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. It was enough to look around and compare. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content. The Nazi doctrine did not provide for the debate. It demanded obedience. But American camps allowed access to doubt. And it was precisely this doubt that began to erode the most well-cemented certainties. What was once conviction turned into discomfort. What was pride turned into restlessness. The American system did not offer ready-made answers. It offered dangerous questions. And that was more lethal than any interrogation. One prisoner would write down in his diary, "Here, even the president is questioned. How can I believe in a system that demands silence when the enemy thrives among dissenting voices?" Radio played a crucial role in this process. Shows like The Fred Allen Show and Command Performance hit the fields with satire about the war, criticism of the government itself, and jokes about the American way of life. The prisoner, accustomed to Goebbels' monochromatic propaganda, found himself surrounded by multiple narratives. And the most disturbing thing, the system did not collapse because of this. Quite the opposite. It worked better. The contrast was stark. While the Reich eliminated writers, Americans printed newspapers for prisoners. While Berlin hunted for political jokes, American radio made the country laugh at itself. The psychological impact was profound. The doctrine of the Third Reich depended on the idea of purity, unity, and absolute control of information. But in the face of American plurality, this architecture collapsed. It was impossible to compete with a system where even mistakes could be debated publicly. Transparency proved to be a form of strength, and for the indoctrinated soldier, who believed he was fighting for an absolute truth, exposure to contradiction was unbearable. Internal divisions began to emerge. Those who still defended Hitler found themselves isolated. Those who doubted gained a voice. The ideological cells were crumbling, not by explosion, but by lighting. In 1945, an internal survey conducted by the War Department Special Projects Division revealed that in certain camps, more than 40% of prisoners no longer identified with the principles of Nazism after 6 months of exposure to the American system. There was no active propaganda, only passive freedom. An engineer captured at Monte Cassino wrote in his notebook, "They did not convince me, they just let me see it." This was the essence of democracy's invisible weapon, not to indoctrinate but to allow access. And this access was devastating because it did not impose, it seduced by reason. Internal newspapers written by prisoners began to circulate among the blocks with opinion columns, philosophical essays, and even debates between Christians and atheists, conservatives and socialists. Plurality, previously considered chaos, showed order at another level. A type of order based on consent, not enforcement. The younger ones especially were the first to give in. Raised under the Führer's pedagogy, they now found themselves facing a universe where authority was questioned but respected, where the structure was supported without an iron fist, and where war was fought with ideas, not slogans. But not all prisoners accepted this change. Many denounced colleagues for weak thoughts, for Americanization. The ideological conflict intensified within the fences. It was no longer between Americans and Germans, it was between the Germans themselves. Camps such as Camp Ruston in Louisiana began separating groups of prisoners to avoid ideological clashes. A group organized itself into cells loyal to the Reich, trying to re-establish discipline and punish the traitors. But the damage was already done. The idea had been planted, and ideas, unlike bullets, cannot be contained by barbed wire. A confidential War Department report, dated December 1945, described the effect of access to information as the most efficient method of re-education ever recorded in a military prison setting. It wasn't just about dissolving Nazism. It was about building a new consciousness, an awareness that would be brought back to ruined Germany months later, when those same prisoners returned, not as defeated soldiers, but as vectors of a new understanding. And it is precisely in this return that the next shock lies, because when these men returned to Reich territory, they took with them something more dangerous than weapons or plans: memory. And that memory, of the camps that didn't look like prisons, of the radio stations that mocked power, of the open libraries, would begin to rewrite German history from the inside out. The question that hovered was simple and devastating: how to fight an enemy that wins even when it leaves us free. The answer, as we shall see below, lay in a strategic decision as bold as it was quiet, a reintegration operation that would begin to redraw the moral map of Europe. When trains crossed the Rhine in 1946, bringing back thousands of former German prisoners, it wasn't just the end of a military cycle, it was the beginning of a quiet transformation. They returned with the Reich uniform still on their bodies, but with other baggage in their pockets and in their minds. Many carried battered notebooks, filled with notes on American farming techniques, irrigation systems, industrial management schemes, models of local democracy and English words copied from newspapers. Some carried seeds, literally, from Texas, hidden between layers of clothing. Others brought books, letters exchanged with families in Kansas or Louisiana, bread recipes, Bible verses written down by hand by ladies from the Methodist Church. And all, without exception, had a doubt that would never leave them. How were we so deceived? The first months on German soil were of reverse shock. What was once known now seemed archaic. The cities were in ruins, the administration disorganized, the supply systems bankrupt. Many former prisoners, accustomed to the American productive order, began to volunteer in the local reorganization. In Stuttgart, a former lieutenant took on the role of food distribution coordinator and, using the methods observed at Camp Swift, organized a community logistics system that fed 5,000 people for 3 months. In Hanover, a 26-year-old engineer who had worked at a cannery in Missouri introduced a voluntary shift management model that doubled bread production in 2 weeks. The transformation was not limited to the economy. On the political level, the impact was even more profound. Of the 400,000 prisoners who passed through the US, more than 20,000 would take on administrative duties in the following decades. Among them, at least 50 would become parliamentarians in the new Bundestag, 7 would hold ministerial positions in state governments, and dozens would lead unions, schools, cooperatives, and town halls. Men who had previously repeated the Führer's slogans now advocated freedom of the press and direct elections. The change was not imposed by a court, it was planted by observation and harvested in silence. The greatest irony in history is that the American prison camp has become unintentionally a university of democracy, and not only of political theory, but of everyday practice. They saw a society where women ran factories, blacks exercised authority, civilians questioned generals, journalists criticized presidents, and everything continued to work. This image was nailed, and when they returned, they did not seek to rebuild what existed, they sought to reinvent it. One of the former prisoners, Karl Mertens, would write in his autobiography, "I learned more in 6 months at Camp Herne than I did in 10 years in the army, because there I saw a system that didn't need my obedience to work, only my participation." Even in the symbolic field, the return was loaded with meaning. During the Nuremberg trial, several Wehrmacht officers sought to distance themselves from Nazi ideology. But those who had been prisoners in the United States did not have to justify it. They just had to observe their actions. In Munich, a group of former captives founded an association of pro-democracy former prisoners. In Bremen, a community newspaper began circulating with editorials written by a former sergeant captured in Tunisia, who was now promoting debates on religious freedom and the right to strike. The doctrine that formed them, rigid, authoritarian, racist, did not resist the contrast with the system that welcomed them, because deep down the American camp was not a punishment. It was a showcase, and those who looked carefully did not come back the same. There is no clause in a peace treaty that explains what happened, because what changed post-war Germany was not just the bombings, the trials, or the territorial division. It was the memory, intimate, silent, persistent, of what they saw on the other side of the barbed wire. The enemy, after all, was not only stronger, it was freer. And this, for someone who had been raised under shouts of order, was unacceptably fascinating. When looking at the German Renaissance in the following decades, it is impossible to ignore this seed planted in Texan, Georgian, Californian soil. Germany's moral reconstruction, its turn to democracy, to pluralism, to tolerance, was not born only from the rubble. It also sprang from the prison camps. Every bed with clean sheets, every newspaper uncensored, every lunch with dessert, every sermon translated, all this was, without fanfare, a form of war. A war won without firing a single shot. The American general Lucius Clay, responsible for the Allied occupation of Germany, would say years later, the real victory was not in Berlin. It was in each mind that it chose freedom after having seen it at work. This is the least commented legacy of the Second World War, that democracy did not impose itself by force. It showed itself and won by example. But even with this turnaround, one last detail remains a question mark in the minds of those who study this history. Why did the Third Reich never anticipate that its greatest defeat would come not from an amphibious landing, but from a Texas coffee shop, a makeshift library, a wooden church in Alabama? This answer perhaps is in the confession of one of his own officers, recorded in a letter upon returning to Germany, and that will be the last secret revealed. By 1946 the war was over, but for thousands of former German prisoners, something essential still remained in abeyance, a sense of belonging. When they returned to Germany, what they found was a devastated, split, morally shaken, and institutionally ruined country. There was no Reich, no Führer, no glory. All that remained were destroyed cities, scarcity of everything, and a people who looked at them with suspicion. To many of them, Germany no longer felt like home. It felt like a shadow, and the memory of what they had experienced in the American camps began to take another form: nostalgia. For the first time, soldiers who had pledged allegiance to National Socialism were considering something unthinkable months earlier: starting over on the other side of the ocean. The most symbolic fact of this turning point is straightforward. More than 5,000 former German prisoners of war applied for permanent visas to live legally in the United States in the following years. The number may seem small compared to the 425,000 who have been detained, but its symbolic impact is devastating. We are talking about men who in 1942 swore that they would die for the Reich, and who in 1952 preferred to be farmers in Kansas rather than citizens of the new Germany. Moral transformation had become a life choice. Many others returned as tourists, students, or guest professors. Some went further. Georg Gartner, a former Wehrmacht officer, fled his camp in 1945, assumed a new identity, married, raised children, and lived as an American until he voluntarily surrendered to the US government decades later. His motivation, when asked, was not ideological. It was simple. Here I was treated as a human being. The baffling truth is that the American system hasn't just imprisoned soldiers, it has converted minds, not by indoctrination, but by exposure, by the repetition of a daily logic where freedom coexisted with efficiency, diversity with productivity, and respect with authority. For men trained in the rigor of obedience, this was a strange and fascinating way to live. The immigration applications came with emotional letters, some addressed to the families who had taken them in, others accompanied by recommendations from American commanders. In many cases, the former field guards themselves testified in favor of these men remaining in the US. The State Department, in reviewing the requests, was divided. It was necessary to distinguish between ideologically committed prisoners and those who had undergone a process of real transformation. Several were accepted, and over time they integrated into American life with surprising naturalness. They became bakers, teachers, engineers, mechanics, shepherds, rural workers. Some even held leadership positions in small rural communities, and among them there was a recurring pattern, valuing freedom with responsibility, something they had first known on the other side of the fence. This moral turn, unlike any military plan, was spontaneous. There was no script, no manual, and no rigid re-education plan. It was the result of continuous exposure to the functional normality of a society that did not need to prove itself with shouting. Democracy in practice was more seductive than any propaganda. The result does not appear on battle maps, nor in surrender treaties, but it does appear in testimonies, letters, and life decisions. And most strikingly, many of these men, upon returning to Germany, became active advocates of the new democratic regime. They founded clubs of former prisoners aimed at the dissemination of democratic values, wrote books, promoted exchanges. They became, ironically, agents of the same freedom that they once fought. In the archives of the National Archives in Washington, a letter draws attention. It is from 1957, written by a former German corporal named Otto Rehmann. He states, "America won the war not because it defeated me with weapons, but because it routinely convinced me. In the silence of the camps, I saw what my nation has never been able to show: respect for those who think differently." This simple phrase defines the endpoint of this historical metamorphosis. The field, designed to contain, eventually opened. The fence, designed to limit, became a window, and the temporary prison became a permanent school. The impact of this silent diaspora goes beyond immigration. It resonated in post-war German culture, in the way the new state was constituted, in the way West Germany aligned itself with the West. It was not only the Marshall Plan or NATO that brought Berlin to the side of democracy. It was also the living memory of thousands of ordinary men who saw with their own eyes an alternative system at work, with imperfections, yes, but with dignity, freedom, and abundance. And in view of this, what the Reich had offered seemed to them at last small. But before this story ends, there is still one last piece that needs to be fitted. A letter written in 1947 by an SS officer who spent 2 years in detention in Texas. His name was omitted from the records, but his account remained. In it, one sentence contains not only his personal reflection, but perhaps the greatest irony of the entire war. "The defeat of the Reich began on the day I was forced to shake hands with a black guard, not out of humiliation, but because I realized he was freer than I ever was." This sentence will be the key to the next and penultimate part. What the German prisoners saw in America was not a spectacle set up to impress them. There was no parade of tanks, triumphalist speeches, or propaganda posters on the fences. What they saw was, paradoxically, the opposite of that: silence. Administrative silence, moral silence. Silence of a power that did not need to shout its strength because it was visible in every daily gesture. They saw clean toilets in temporary installations. They saw plumbing working with millimeter precision, even in the simplest living quarters. They saw workers in headscarves controlling industrial treadmills with more autonomy than many Reich lieutenants. They saw blacks in uniform carrying folders, signing reports, examining patients, and doing it naturally, without fear, without hiding. They saw newspapers criticizing the warring government, radio stations broadcasting political satire in the midst of a crisis, farmers demanding better prices while fueling the greatest logistical effort in modern history. What for Americans was the flow of democratic routine, for prisoners was a philosophical rupture. Every common gesture was, for them, a moral subversion. Freedom, presented without pride or explanation, became an intolerable mirror for eyes accustomed to rigidity. There was no class, there was exposure. And this exposition acted slowly like rust on doctrinal steel. Over the months, what was seen as weakness, questioning, debate, plurality, imposed itself as invulnerability. What the Reich tried to erase with repression, democracy nurtured with confidence. One of the most symbolic confessions comes from Hans Gruber, a former Luftwaffe logistics officer, who said in 1950, "Nothing shocked me more than to see an American guard, black, correcting a German corporal, and doing so with visible moral authority. At that moment I realized that it wasn't him who was out of place, it was me." The American view of the world, constructed without knowing that it was being watched, struck these men with a force that was impossible to resist, because it did not come from above, nor from speeches. It came from real life. Unpretentious liberty proved more destructive to doctrine than any Allied bomb. If you've made it this far, think, what's more powerful, an ideology imposed by fear, or a society that doesn't need to explain its strength because it spills over into the most ordinary details? And if, like prisoners, you too were surprised by what everyday life can destroy, get ready. Because the last piece of this story is not in the fields, it is in the legacy that no one dared to admit. Nazi ideology, forged in the steel of discipline and blind belief in superiority, was not only defeated on the battlefields, it was quietly dismantled in the prison camps of the United States. There, without gunfire or interrogation, men who had been trained to hate discovered a society that functioned without fear, an industry that produced without torture, a culture that valued freedom as a weapon. Germany's collapse was not just military, it was moral, and it began when his soldiers, captured, realized that they had fought a mirage. America won not only with pumps, but with electric coffee makers, libraries, unions, and free radios. The totalitarian system, which promised order, was defeated by the naturalness of a society that did not need marches to be powerful. The great lesson of this war is not in maps or fences, but in a realization that resonates to this day. Logistics determines strategy, yes, but morality sustains the empire. How many tanks you can produce is important, but more important is why your society is willing to produce them. The phrase that best defines this shock came years later in the words of General Dietrich von Choltitz, commander of Paris. We were defeated by trucks, and for freedom. If you value serious research, history in detail, and facts that reveal the cogs behind speeches, support this channel with your like and subscription. It helps keep the search for historical truth alive. Comment here which data shocked you the most in this video. Production, morale, freedom. Activate the bell because in the next report, we will reveal another devastating fact that changed the war without a single shot. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.